Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. It's been a while since I've recorded anything, well, at least as myself, and you'll be pleased to know that Gabriel Chase will not be making another appearance. In fact, I've had so many emails from people saying how much they don't like Gabriel Chase's performance that what I've decided to do in this kind of bumper edition is go back over the last 2 episodes and do them as myself. Some people were wondering why I'd done them as a character. Well, I thought it was kind of funny having somebody, sort of like a TV historian, talking about the Daleks like they were, something from history. Obviously, this didn't go down as well as I would have liked, so here we go. For those of you who want to know about Dalek history, but really didn't want to put up with my wonderful voice, here we can go as myself. Now, the source for these Dalek histories that I'm going to present to you are from the deeply, deeply wonderful Discontinuity Guide, which I think's been reprinted, and you can get a very nice copy. Now, unfortunately, the Discontinuity Guide, which is a bit like a continuity guide, only has lots of funny bits, doesn't have anything to do with the new series, mainly because some of the authors of the new series actually are authors of this book, and they can hardly take the mick out of their own work without seeming, churlish. So, there is an online version of this book which I desperately suggest you track down. Now, this is also taken from the BBC website with a history of the Daleks as well. Okay, the Daleks, as we know, are small, green blobs of hate inside travel machines. They're a bit like a tank. They are mutants, post-atomic war stuff. All of these facts are fairly well accepted. However, once we get into the nitty-gritty and the details behind the stories, we start seeing kind of issues that come up. The best way to think of the history of the Daleks is to split it into 3 groups. Some people want to see the history as one continuous strand. Lawrence Miles has a theory on this. You can track that down on the internet. It's basically a way that history is not changed. It's always happened and all of the outcomes are always there. It's kind of if you believe in fate. Now, the whole point of a time travel show to me is that you can change the past. You can go back, you can alter things, you can fix things, you can put things right or not. I know the Doctor's got a whole non-interventionist policy, but let's face it, he turns up and changes things, and because he thinks it's alright, he can do it, but he doesn't want anyone else doing it. There's Blinovitch limitation effects, which basically means you can't turn up and, do the entire plot of Father's Day. Moving on. You shouldn't really be able to occupy the same space and time. But then, of course, you've got multi-Doctor stories. Oh, just leave it and walk away. Time travel will give you a headache. It'll turn you into an Austin Powers subplot. It's not important. The important thing to remember is that although we experience the Doctor's life is first incarnation, second incarnation, third incarnation, and so on, he's not experiencing the Doctors in the same order. There is an argument that he's experiencing the Master in the same order that his own life is going on. But even then, I'm not that thrown or even convinced by that argument. So, basically, if the Doctor meets Dalek A in 1970, the second Doctor, the next Doctor along, might meet Dalek A in 1960, if you see what I mean. So we're going forward in our watching of the show, but we're seeing something further back in time. So if we deal with Dalek history as the main thrust of the program, we get a whole different perspective on the stories because they're not happening in the same order that we see them in, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's start off with the first history of the Daleks. Now, the reason there's a first history becomes obvious at the end of it. Now, for those of you who want to experience these stories by watching them, an ideal point to start is, of course, at the very beginning. And being Doctor Who, it's never straightforward. There are 2 very beginnings. But the very beginning for us, what we'll do is we'll take the very first story, what's become known as the Daleks. Now, in the past, Doctor Who, the show, used to have individual episode titles for every single story. The story that's become known as the Daleks was about 6 episodes long, and it was on at the end of 1963, beginning of 64, and had the first Doctor arrive on Skaro with his companion, that's his granddaughter Susan, Ian and Barbara, and they wander around a jungle and find a city. Now the jungle is desiccated, it's sort of fossilised, but they find this huge metallic city on the other side, enter the city and discover some robots. They discover that the robots aren't in fact robots at all, but they are survival tanks called Daleks of a race who were called the Dals, and the Dals had taken to hiding inside these machines because they were horribly mutated as a side effect of a war. The stories of the war had been lost over the generations, and the war was with a race called the Thals. Now, Terry Nation, who wrote this, has got the Thals and the Dals. Basically, it's a metaphor for two races that are almost exactly the same, but with one slight difference being at war. Thal, Dal, makes complete sense. It's not until 1974, with a Tom Baker story, that we're presented with a different original race that gave rise to the Daleks. Instead of the Dals, we have the Khaleds. Of course, I'm getting ahead of myself because that's the second history of the Daleks. So, these Daleks are fairly rudimentary. They can't leave the city, they run on static electricity, they're not particularly advanced. But they are quite threatening, they're quite violent, they have definite characters, which puts them apart from robots, and these Daleks basically just want to take out the Thals. It's a planetary-wide, explosion, it's a war, it's a one-off thing. Now, the thing worthy of note from the whole TV series was planned out in advance kind of a way, which of course we know is true. Point is that the Doctor does not know who the Daleks are. He's never heard of them. He's never given it any thought. He's never come across them. He's surprised by them. But later on in the Doctor's life, say the 5 Doctors, it's implied that the Daleks were never allowed to play the game of Rassilon. Now obviously this is part of the side effect from the post-genesis of the Daleks' intervention. But if the Doctor has never heard of the Daleks at all, then the chances are the Daleks, without the Doctor ever arriving on Skaro, which is the name of the planet, the Daleks would never have escaped Skaro, they would never have become a dominant force, they would never have invaded Earth, they would never have threatened Gallifrey, there would never have been a time war, they would never have amounted to anything other than domination of the one planet. There is another argument that there are 2 lots of Daleks, the rather rubbish Daleks that I met in the first story, and another lot of Daleks who were the ones hidden in a bunker who escaped in the spaceship. That is kind of the only way that this continuity works, and it does explain how at the end of this story the Daleks are completely destroyed, and then years later they come back and have invaded Earth. So the fact that the Doctor hasn't experienced the Daleks does lead me to believe that the Doctor is responsible for the Daleks becoming what they eventually become, which is a galactic threat, a universal threat. I'm probably just confusing people. Shall I move on? So, the next story in this Dalek history seems to be the Daleks' invasion of Earth. Also, it's the second story that we experience as viewers. Daleks' invasion of Earth we see at some point in the 22nd century. It's important to work out, or to realise, that the Doctor never establishes a date for this story. He often says things like 1,000,000 years in the future, but you do get the feeling that he's just kind of saying that to fob off Ian and Barbara. You do also get the feeling with the first Doctor there's a lot of fobbing off involved. Kind of a, if I just stand here and look impressive, you'll leave me alone kind of a thing. So, you've got 2 lots of Daleks. You've got the ones that the first Doctor's met, and they've been destroyed. You've also got this other lot of Daleks that left and flew off. Now, by the time of Planet of the Daleks, that's the 26th century, the events of the first Doctor story have become, myth. They've become legend for the Thal people. So these more advanced Daleks who've developed their own technology, which have enabled non-Daleks to become Dalek mutants, and a large number of them have gone out into space, and then by the time of Planet of the Daleks, that's set in the 26th century, the tale of the Thal's attack on the Dalek cities become a legend, and so is the Doctor, so is Ian and Barbara and Susan. Now this is to the Thal people. However, at this point in our history of the Daleks, we need to jump to the second Doctor story, Evil of the Daleks, which is odd because obviously as viewers we've experienced Dalek invasion of Earth, but again, given time travel, this is fine. So, the more advanced Daleks that had developed their own technology, that was enabled non-Daleks, non-Khalids, to become Dalek mutants, and a large number of them return to Skaro and begin work on time travel technology. Now, to do this, they need the help of a man called Theodore Maxable. This is dealt with in Evil of the Daleks. You can't really work out, but basically a civil war breaks out on Skaro, and this results in the Thals once again being able to live there in peace. So it looks like all of the Daleks at that point are kind of wiped out. So, one of the ships that escapes the destruction on Skaro crashes on a planet called Vulcan. Yes, I know Vulcan, but Doctor Who did use it before certain other TV series, but it doesn't mean that Doctor Who has the priority over Vulcan on the grounds that it's actually ancient Roman, I believe. So, these Daleks actually recognise the second Doctor, the ones that are on Vulcan, because they had experienced him in Evil of the Daleks. However, the order that we've experienced the episodes in is different, but that's fine, that's absolutely fine. So, the Earth colonists haven't really heard of the Daleks at this point, because the first major encounter with the Daleks comes actually later, which of course is in Daleks' Invasion of the Earth, again with the first Doctor. I'm sorry if this isn't making sense. Please look at the show notes, or indeed just look at your collection. Around this point, the Daleks probably discover time travel and attempt to turn this defeat into victory by going back in time and invading Earth in the late 21st century. Having invaded Earth, there's a line where they say, "We have changed the pattern of history." Now, the Doctor's intervention a century later in Day of the Daleks is so successful that this alternative timeline doesn't actually happen. This episode's extremely good, well worth watching, although it does just look like Terminator to the untrained eye. So these Daleks have then been defeated twice, in Daleks' Invasion of Earth and Day of the Daleks, but of course they've only really been defeated the once, because once is a reworking of history, if that makes sense. So then, between the 23rd and 25th centuries, the Daleks encounter the Third Doctor again. That's in an untelevised story, and this is where the deadly space plague is mentioned in Genesis of the Daleks comes from. So then you've got Death to the Daleks, and in Death to the Daleks that seems to take place before Planet of the Daleks, but then again, are we shown them in the same order? Can you see how confusing this can be? It doesn't really matter, but on the second episode the Daleks don't recognise the Third Doctor, but in the other one they do. So they seem to be updating their own files as soon as they're aware of the Doctor's identity changing. Or could this just be sloppy writing? I couldn't possibly comment. Let's face it was the 70s, people were just happy the Daleks were on TV almost every other week. So, by this point, the Earth has a pact with the Draconian Alliance, and the Daleks are about to try and conquer the entire galaxy using a huge invisible army. Remember, invisible armies are very cheap to make, and everyone just says they've got them, and no one can actually prove it either way. So it's an ideal invasion force. So these Thals, who obviously can remember the original one, it's Planet of the Daleks, there you go, Spiridon, are you Sylvester McCoy or not? We'll get back to you on that one. I am rambling too much. Basically, the Daleks are really annoyed by the amount of interference the Doctor seems to have been doing in their plans. And to that end, the Daleks, who've discovered time corridor technology, according to the Fifth Doctor, or pure time travel, they seem to have a version of their own TARDIS in order to try and take out the Doctor early on. Some people would see this as a very, very early part of the Time War. I don't know, I can't see an issue with it not being part of the Time War. Let's face it, the Daleks try and take out the Doctor by travelling back to take out his first incarnation in the story that we've seen as The Chase. Now obviously, so this is something like the third ever Dalek story as far as we're concerned watching it, but The Chase seems to happen, as far as the Daleks are concerned, almost at the time that we as viewers are watching the third Doctor stories. Obviously things like Mission to the Unknown, what we saw as a first Doctor story, tells us facts about Dalek conquering of other systems. At this point, it would be logical to assume that the Daleks are actually fighting the Movellans, and they travel back to Skaro to try and see if Davros survived. Davros, their original creator, did not survive in this history, and therefore they go on to try and dominate. Although they're losing, I mean, let's face it, they don't manage to kill the first Doctor, they don't manage to destroy the timeline. The timeline's fairly intact by this point. The Mary Celestin visits to the Empire State Building aside, seen in The Chase, the history seems to be fairly well intact. Despite all this, the Time Lords see a point when the Daleks could be a huge threat. So they decide to instigate the Fourth Doctor to go back in time and alter Dalek history. This is the story Genesis of the Daleks. Genesis of the Daleks is one of the best stories Doctor Who ever did. There's very little argument in this. The thing is, the BBC have repeated it so many times that in England it's one of the stories that most of the non-Doctor Who fans have seen quite a lot of. The character of Davros, the creator of the Daleks, is introduced for the very first time. And from now until the show's demise in 1989, Davros becomes an enormous part of Doctor Who mythology. There isn't a single Dalek story that happens without his appearance. This is the second history of the Daleks. The Doctor manages to change history in this story, resulting in Davros surviving at the end. The Doctor talks to Davros and makes him so paranoid about the Daleks that he switches on his own force field and his life support system so that when he is shot by the Daleks at the end of the story, he survives. Now, how come the Daleks have just left him in the corner of a room with about 2 spiders for what's known as 1,000 years, which is usually Doctor Who shorthand for loads of time? Implies, when you're first watching it, that the Daleks just kind of abandoned him, just walked away. And it also means that the other Dalek history could still have happened in this 1,000 years. Again, the Lawrence Miles theories that everything fits together fit at this point. So, Genesis of the Daleks, the Doctor is offered the chance of destroying the Daleks or altering history or putting something into their genetic makeup to make them less aggressive. He doesn't manage to make them less aggressive, but he does manage just to mess them about a bit, basically turning a megalomaniac into a spoilt brat. Unfortunately, this does reflect well where they almost become caricatures of themselves. I am, of course, getting ahead of myself. So, after Genesis of the Daleks, you thought Davros was dead. Then comes along, a long time later, 5-6 years later, you've got Destiny of the Daleks, where the Daleks, again, are still at war with the Movellans. But the Movellans are robots, pure logic. It's a very, very nice story. A lot of people don't like it. Skaro, of course, is still the desolate wasteland that we saw in Genesis, not the jungle we saw in the original Dalek story. Is there a reason for this? Is it just another section of Skaro over the horizon, or is there still a frozen jungle? I just don't know. At the end of Resurrection of the Daleks, Davros, the creator of the Daleks, is taken away by human forces and put on trial. Now, he seems to be guilty of trying to make his own race survive. The trials of Davros are never actually seen, unless, of course, you count some lovely stage productions, which I've never got around to. They're discussed in the third history of the Daleks. But this point, we're talking about stuff which has just been on TV. This is stuff which is pure canon, pure history, pure stuff you can watch, you can go back to, you can experience, you can discuss, without fear of somebody going, oh yeah, but that didn't really happen, or that's just a story, or that's just something we heard. That's what a lot of Doctor Who fans discuss as canon. I can do a whole show on this another time, but basically, stuff that's been on TV is real, stuff that's been in another media is seen by some fans as less real or less fitting in with history. I choose to think that with it being a time travel show, being a multiverse show, all bets are off, all versions of the story are true to some extent. Crashing on. Destiny of the Daleks is followed for us, the viewer, and for Dalek history by Resurrection of the Daleks. Resurrection of the Daleks is seen with Davros frozen. Leslie Grantham's in this story, for those EastEnders fans amongst us. I think it was his first TV role, could be wrong. And Rodney Bewes. It's one of those 80s star-studded things where none of the stars actually meet up. Of course, the guy who plays Lytton in one of the Cyberman stories is in this. Not important, we'll come back to it. You think the Dalek history is complicated? Wait till you experience the Cyberman history. Moving on. At the end of Resurrection of the Daleks, Davros kind of is attacked by the virus that the Movellans used to win the war. Davros is exclaiming that he isn't a Dalek and is shouting and ranting about not being a Dalek. I'm not a Dalek. And he starts taking ill in exactly the same way that Daleks take ill. Now, the fact that the virus could just attack the Khalid mutant and Davros was a Khalid could be connected. I don't know. He never seemed to grasp this. But the fact that the Daleks are very good geneticists still stays with us today. So at the end of that story, you think Davros is dead. He escapes and goes off. Now, Davros escaping is all well and good, which brings us to the Sixth Doctor story, Revelation of the Daleks. Revelation of the Daleks is a great story. However, the first part of the story doesn't have the Doctor in it very much, which was a huge problem when you were a kid watching Doctor Who at the time. You're going, it's a load of backstory, it's very nice, it's got Davros in it, what more do you need? It's all mystery, it's suspense, but is the Doctor in this story, or is he just wandering around a graveyard for 40 minutes until the last 5 minutes when you see some bloke after keeping up appearances? Davros in this story is on the planet Necros. He's described himself as the Great Healer and is basically on the run from the Daleks. He's on the run from the real Daleks because secretly in the vaults of this enormous cemetery, Davros is creating new Daleks. He's taking Dalek human tissue from across the universe, and turning them into Daleks, into conditioned creatures. Now, the whole point of the original Dalek was for the Skaro people to survive. But now Davros is creating a whole new race of creature, something different. These Daleks become known as the Imperial Daleks, the white Daleks. They're the ones with the gold knobbly bits, or cream. They're cream with gold. They're quite nice to look at. They're very Art Deco. The real Daleks, the ones from Skaro, aren't happy about this. And as always, they're really into racial purity. They turn up to arrest Davros and take out the other Daleks. So we've got two lots of Daleks. This whole two lots of Dalek theme runs all the way through the very last story. This is the Sylvester McCoy story, Remembrance of the Daleks. Remembrance of the Daleks is part of that whole looking back at Doctor Who history sort of thing. You've got someone who could be seen as Davros, who isn't Davros, who's a child, in the very first episodes. When you're watching this, when you were a kid, you were convinced that Davros had his back to you. Remembrance of the Daleks is a lovely story to watch. It's got some errors, things like Sylvester McCoy saying they're creatures encased in bonded polycarbide armour. And all of the old school fans went, what, Daleks aren't in armour made of Dalekanium anymore? What, are they like budget versions of Daleks? And then some bricks fall on them and kill them, and you realise, yes, they are budget versions of Daleks. So, the main thrust of this story is the Doctor's trying to orchestrate, in 1963, a lovely battle between Dalek A, who are the new Daleks, the Daleks in orbit. Now, they're the Daleks that you think are the traditional Daleks, but in fact, they're the ones run by Davros. Davros is now only a head in what looked like the old-fashioned Emperor Dalek casing. There's a black Dalek on Earth running things from sort of down here, and they're both trying to get their hands on an object from Gallifrey called the Hand of Omega, which is a stellar manipulator, or the sort of thing you fly at a sun to turn it into a black hole so you can run time experiments. Apparently, the white-haired fella, or the First Doctor as he's known, left the Hand of Omega on Earth. Left the Hand of Omega on Earth in 1963, a mere month or so before this story's set, which implies that the First Doctor left Gallifrey with Susan and the Hand of Omega and left it there because of the threat from the Daleks. But as we've discussed earlier, about 10 minutes ago, the Doctor didn't know about the Daleks. They were unknown to him. You see, things like the Fifth Doctor saying the Daleks were very good at the game of death and the Gallifreyans always being worried about the Daleks isn't implied at the beginning, which for me means that the best way to defeat the Daleks completely is to remove the Doctor from the time stream. A universe without the Doctor is well worth discussing, but that would be for another time. So, in 1989, we're left with Davros escaping the ship and ending up in orbit around Earth, both Dalek factions completely destroyed, and Skaro being a complete burnt-out husk because the Stellar Manipulator crashed straight into Skaro. Skaro is completely destroyed, the Daleks are largely wiped out, Davros is in orbit, that's where it finishes. Which kind of brings us up to the third history of the Daleks. This is the spurious bit. This is the bit that takes us from the end of Revelation through the 9 years when the series is off and into this new series of Doctor Who. The best place to find Doctor Who during these wilderness years was on the pages of Doctor Who magazine. Also, the Virgin novels, and then, following the McGann movie, the BBC novels. Now, Virgin's writing guide consisted mainly of big warnings saying, no multi-Doctor stories, don't meet the Daleks, we can't afford them, please go away and write original stories. Which they did, and they were marvellous. The Daleks were mentioned in passing, in a kind of a distant, off-world kind of a way. The character of Ace eventually left the Doctor for a while to fight Daleks, and came back as an older, wiser Dorothy McShane, or whatever they decided her surname was, after fighting them. The new adventures were great. They were fabulous. And eventually, of course, after the McGann film, worthy of note because the Daleks seem to sound like Smurfs and have put the Master on trial. Yes, why was the Master on trial? Why was he... Just let it go there. The Daleks have put the Master on trial in the Paul McGann 8th Doctor story, and that's why the Doctor turns up on Skaro and gets the ashes. You never see a Dalek, you just hear them. They're not very good Dalek sounding things, but you don't know. I always assumed that it was a bunch of Daleks killing the Master at once, rather than just one. It's kind of overkill, but let's face it, the Daleks are good at that sort of thing. So, in these wilderness years, a good place to see the Daleks, rather than just read about them, was Doctor Who magazine. Now, these stories, every so often Daleks would turn up. The 8th Doctor had wonderful stories, but all of these stories took place in the post-Genesis of the Daleks universe. Except for one of them, which seemed to take place in an odd combination of the pre-Genesis and post-Genesis, Patrick Troughton After Effect. Basically, the Daleks with the human factor, and these are the ones discussed, I believe, a long time ago. Let me just check my notes. Evil of the Daleks, I believe that story was. The ones that survived that story then took on more human qualities, handed in their weapons, and lived on a planet in peace. Unfortunately, underneath the planet, there was a large squid psychic monstery thing, which kind of scuppered the process. But they were calling the Doctor the Saviour, the Messiah. It was a very nice twist. You could see the Daleks in this medium. We never truly thought Doctor Who would come back, but fans wanted them to come back, wanted everyone back. Fan-made audios turned into Big Finish audios, and Big Finish was licensed, and they had licenses coming out of their ears because the BBC was just going to ignore them. So, Big Finish, the audio company, decided to bring the Daleks back. Again, all of these audios seem to take place in a variant history that's kind of an amalgam of both histories. The Dalek Empire series, the first Dalek Empire, seemed to fit together in a Daleks trying to take over the universe, early Time War kind of a way. Started off with the Sylvester McCoy story, The Mutant Phase, where some Daleks are trying to break into a library. Oh yes, it's quite hot stuff. Yeah, perhaps they should just join. I don't know. The Apocalypse element, well worth a look. Actually, no, that wasn't it. The mutant phase was the Peter Davidson story. Now that one's got a sort of time loop thing going on. It's set many years after the Daleks' invasion of Earth, and many years during the Daleks' invasion of Earth. It kind of jumps around. There's a Dalek who gets bitten by a wasp. Yeah, as you can see, it's all cutting-edge story stuff. There's a Dalek bitten by a wasp, and that mutates into a sort of killer Dalek thing. The Apocalypse element is the Sixth Doctor story, and that's got a lot to do. If you ever wanted to experience an early battle in the Time War, I would definitely recommend this as something worth listening to. It's the Sixth Doctor. It's got President Romana, who's been missing for 20 years. I won't tell you too much about it. I won't spoil it. It's quite good if you're a big fan with a lot of continuity. However, if you just want to experience it, you're going to be sitting there. The Time War is just for fans, to be fair. It's not important to casual listeners. The other stories that follow along from this are Jubilee, again set in a very odd time-travel-y parallel world, England, where the Daleks were defeated very, very early on, which has affected history. Now, Jubilee, a lot of people have said, was the origin for the Doctor Who story Dalek, the 2005 season, the Christopher Eccleston one. You can see the origins in the sense of it's got a Dalek who's being tortured, who is questioned and has to question himself. However, the overall plot concerning an alternative fascist England and Martin Jarvis and a lot of other things has very, very little and is never translated. It's a great story. It's well worth experiencing. However, like the mutant phase, the use of time travel to get out of the story just seems disappointing. To me, I don't know about anyone else. The Genocide Machine, that's the one I meant earlier. That's the one where the Daleks try to join a library. Oh yes, 4 episodes of complete, have you got a phone bill? Yes, you can join our library. In our library we have... Sorry, I'm doing a voice. You don't like that? I'm sorry. The Daleks are trying to get access to information on the Apocalypse element. The Apocalypse element is what leads back to the Sixth Doctor story. Again, we're experiencing stories not in the right order. If you just go Doctor, Doctor, Doctor. There is an audio called Death and the Daleks, of which I know nothing about. I believe that's a Bernice Summerfield story. And then, of course, there's the Dalek Empire series, which are very, very similar in respect to a lot of Blake Seven stories. I don't know these, let's face it, I can't afford to buy everything by Big Finish. However, if Big Finish want to send me some discs, I will, for free, that's free, I'll definitely review them. No questions asked. So, we've then got, before I go into the rest of the audios, actually, let's cover the rest of the audios. Paul McGann signs up at this point, and his Dalek stories are slightly different from what went before. These Dalek stories seem to be happening after everything else. These are continuations of the stories. These seem to be in addition. These are kind of wonderful, to be honest. Time and the Daleks, however, is just odd. The Daleks have landed again and have become fairly benevolent. They are using mirrors to travel in time, and I know there's a whole, post-modern reference thing, but using mirrors to time travel and a lot of clocks just worries me. But even the Doctor says that this is largely nonsense in the story. These Daleks have kidnapped and removed and replaced Shakespeare, and I don't really need to go in any more depth and see how much that messes with other continuity from later TV shows. Again, you see which one's got priority. Everyone falls back and says the TV show is the important one. It's the one worth referencing. Messing with a childhood Shakespeare who then can't remember things and then in later life meets the Doctor again. See you earlier. It just gets confusing. So, after Time and the Daleks, the 8th Doctor got sucked into this strange timeless dimension for about 2 seasons, which drove a lot of people mental. And of course, by this point, Doctor Who was coming back onto TV. People started panicking. There was going to be a 9th Doctor. Up to this point, Big Finish had complete control over the Daleks. They were the Daleks. Because the BBC were bringing everything back, and McGann wouldn't be seen to become Eccleston, They still had their gap to fill, but they needed the Doctor back in our universe just to try and help things along. And so, the Time War isn't gone into just yet. We have a story called Terra Firma, where the Doctor exits reality, exits this other dimension, and ends up on Earth, again Earth controlled by Davros and the Daleks. In this story, however, it's well worth noting that Davros is losing his ability to control the Daleks. He's got too old. What he's decided to do is clone himself a human body, well, his original Skaro body, using his own DNA, and then transfer his consciousness from his withered frame into the new body and have an ordinary life. Basically, Davros wants to retire. Davros is also going completely mental and has replaced so much of himself with Dalek that he becomes the Dalek Emperor. He loses the battle in himself and becomes the Dalek Emperor. Now, these stories are all well and good. There are other stories that were mentioned, things that just have Davros in them, things like the well-known and popular story Davros, where Davros is taken from the 1963 orbiting Earth, crashed derelict spaceship, reanimated, and this story has no Daleks in it whatsoever. And it's lovely to see Davros by himself. It's a very, very good examination of globalization and capital. Am I becoming a little political? I'm sorry. But it is a very good way of viewing a Marxist view of the... See, I've gone political again. I'm sorry. Walk away from it. Walk away. It's a good story. Listen to it. It's got some nice points. Whether you agree with them or not doesn't matter. Davros is still a villain. Moving on. There's another story, The Juggernauts, where Davros finds a load of mechanoids and uses the parts left over from another Doctor Who story, the old heads and body parts, to reanimate the mechanoids. And let's face it, it does feel like a bit of old Doctor Who stories all glued together. It's very good, it's got Mel in it, and you get to hear the actor who plays Davros' voice, his real voice, which is good, unless you're a fan of The Archers, and then you just go, hang on, he's in The Archers. So, we've got Renaissance of the Daleks. Again, it's a Peter Davison story. Again, it's a twisting about with time story. These are all Big Finish tales. The gap between these Big Finish stories and the Time War and how we're left is basically left to readers to read. Of course, there were BBC novelizations. There was War of the Daleks, which tries to blend all of the histories of the Daleks together, but it tries so hard that you're left thinking, this is rubbish. This is really bad continuity. It's gluing things together. I would desperately recommend people not read War of the Daleks, just in order to not have their view of continuity messed about with. The story itself is perfectly acceptable. It's extremely well written, but it's just not my cup of tea. Legacy of the Daleks, which takes place in an Earth after the original Daleks invasion, has Susan in it, and that's a lovely story because the Eighth Doctor and Susan never actually meet. They almost meet in a corridor. Susan ends up stealing the Master's TARDIS and is responsible for the state of the Master in the 1974 regeneration problems, that thing. These are all massive continuity smears, really. Some of them are lovely attempts at joining the dots. Let's face it, everyone likes that game. But as a larger history of the Daleks, you can take or leave the Big Finish stuff. I prefer to take it. I love the Big Finish stuff. So, after that, after Blood of the Daleks, which is the BBC 7 things you may have heard, which is fairly standard Dalek story. The Daleks are evil. The Daleks are trying for racial purity. They wipe out some other people. Those stories are very nice. They could fit anywhere in any Dalek time. So it's best to jump from that into the Dalek history you're aware of. Apparently, there was something called the Cruciform. Apparently, the Daleks took on Gallifrey. Gallifrey took on the Daleks. Who fought first? We just don't know. One Dalek survived screaming through time. Another Dalek survived screaming to the history. That was the Emperor. The Emperor Dalek and all of the Daleks that he's had made from bits of humanity are destroyed by Rose. This is fine. Every single Dalek in existence is destroyed. Is that every single Dalek ever? Are they destroyed at any point? Is this why there's another history of the Daleks? Has everything the Daleks have ever done been removed from history? Has Rose succeeded where the Fourth Doctor failed? I don't think so. I think she just removes them at that point in history because she doesn't think things through. After that, of course, there's the cult of Skaro living in their little sphere. The cult of Skaro gets destroyed in the battle for Canary Wharf with the fake Cybermen. And then the Daleks take Manhattan. Let's face it, of course, being a time travel show, we're experiencing the history of the Daleks in order because they've both time travelled back. We've now got the 10th Doctor. Whether the Daleks appear in the new series, I personally hope not. I remember a point when you were expecting the Daleks to be never in the series. Tom Baker, the longest serving Doctor, only met the Daleks twice. It's worth considering. Perhaps every Doctor only gets to meet the Daleks twice these days. So, I hope you've enjoyed this reasonably short history of the Daleks. All 3 versions, you've probably been shouting at the recording going, well that's wrong. Email me. The address is coming up at the end. Remember, of course, there's the MySpace account where you can join the group and discuss this show with others. You can email me, you can leave comments on the Tin Dog website, and of course, thanks to one of my listeners for creating the new Wikipedia page, which tells you all about the show. It's very nice to know that if you go on Google and type in Tin Dog, you get a whole page mainly about my podcast. And of course, there is Podcast Alley. Remember, I've had almost 10 votes. Yeah, I know other people have had more, but let's face it, it's me and you talking about Doctor Who. What more do you need? I'll be back shortly with another show. However, of course, I have a wedding to organise, so please forgive me if I'm a little bit tardy. Be seeing you. You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. If you have been affected by anything discussed in this show, a helpline has definitely not been set up. However, you can email us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk or leave a comment or a picture at our website www.tin-dog.co.uk. Doctor Who is a registered trademark of the BBC and they'll come round and bite you if you misuse it. No infringement is intended.